We have two really interesting speakers today, both from India, on this topic to give us shed different light on it. First off is Sanchita Shekhar, who has unwavering dedication to education, but also deep expertise in different tech fields. And right now, she will be helping us to look into this topic of reforming and revolutionizing educational structures, especially when they have resilience of tradition, and how to bring in technology as an answer, or hopefully, let's say, interweave it. At least that's how I interpret it. Over to you, Sanchita.
Thank you. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about reforming and revolutionizing educational structures. I know those are big words, but we'll try to break it down and make it really simple. Not super simple, but simple enough, right? So I'm Sanchita. So I've lived around the world in 4 continents. I've studied mostly with very alternative education systems in multiple countries. I worked in a lot of edtech startups, and I've done a lot of research. And I'm also an economist by qualification, and I'm writing a book about institutions. So I'm really curious and excited to learn about structures and to also talk about how structures are formed. So we're going to be talking about that a little bit today. So we're going to start off very high level, very abstract. We're going to start off about what are structures, where do they come from, why are they rigid, and then we're going to really take it in, bring it in, and talk about AI and how does that reflect the 21st century education? How do we accommodate for the rigidity in structures, and what can we do about those things? Okay, so let's start by talking about structures. So what are structures and where do they come from, right? So in this context, we're just going to take a very simple definition of structures. We're just going to say a structure is a system or framework that is followed by a large group of people. So this can be something as small as the community. It can be on a local level, a national level, or an international level. In fact, if you look at a structure, it can just be a group of people who think similarly. It can be a community. It can even be a family. That's also a structure. But for now, we're just going to take it on a slightly bigger level. So on a community level, on an educational system level, local, national, international levels. Okay. So a few features about structures is they might or might not have laws that legitimize them. So for example, the education system has laws that define what you can and cannot teach. Right? There can also be social, economic, or political consequences when a structure is enforced or not enforced. So for example, if instead of a 12-year schooling that might be legalized in a country, if you do 3 years of schooling, you might not be legitimized as a school, right? So that's an example of a structure being enforced. And they're often rigid and difficult to shift. And while these sometimes might sound like bad things, they're actually very good at making sure that information that is added into the structure or the way that the structure is molded and shifted is actually beneficial to the system, right? And we'll talk about how this can or cannot play out, all right? So before we go into structures more fully, let's just talk a little bit about where do structures come from, or where did like the first structure come from, right? So this is my hypothesis, is that structures are just a complex accumulation of ideas that solidify over time, okay? So we'll just go through this a little bit. So say that there's a new idea, all right? So there's a new idea that's born. So say, for example, I decide tomorrow that I really think that the most important thing that needs to be taught in schools, instead of biology, is apple picking, right? Now you might think something else entirely. You might think, you know what, we shouldn't teach apple picking. We should teach AI. A third person might think something completely different. They might think, you know, what's most important is how to make clothes because the people in our society do not have enough clothes. So how do you decide which ideas are important or not? So this is the life cycle of an idea. So say you have an idea. We'll just keep apple picking because I think it's a bit entertaining. So say the idea gains momentum. I successfully managed to convince everybody here that what we need to teach in schools is only apple picking and nothing else, right? So now all of us are gonna go out there and advocate for apple picking, right? I'm not necessarily saying that an idea is a good idea. I'm just saying an idea exists. So apple picking might be a bad idea, right? It might also be a good idea. But say all of us now are advocates for apple picking. Someone in stage 3 is going to start testing out this idea. So say in my school, I replaced biology with apple picking. And now students are not able to tell the components of their body, but they're able to tell you how to go and pick apples and which apples are best for your body. And now you don't really know the consequences of this. So an idea is born, and then it gains momentum, and then it's tested and iterated on, right? And now if this idea is accepted by a large enough group of people, that can be a small community, it can be a larger structure of people. If it eventually gains enough momentum, then we start creating structures around that idea. So we might say, you know what, in this group of people, apple picking is good. So let's start our first school where we're going to only teach apple picking. Now, say that our entire community is convinced that apple picking is a good idea. Then we might create the first laws which say that all schools must teach apple picking now. It sounds a bit silly, but you can use the same model to talk about any idea. This can be climate change, this can be AI, this can be education. But when an idea comes in, it's filtered, it gains momentum, and then structures are built around that idea. And eventually these structures do tend to influence policy. So this is a very bottom-up way of how an idea can create a structure, right? So there's two ways the structures are created. They're either bottom-up, based on the momentum of ideas. So say a large group of people think a similar way. Then oftentimes there are structures that support and create those ideas into a specific structure, right? So now let's talk a little bit about educational structures. That was very abstract. That was very big picture, any structure, right? So an education system this is the way I would define it, is the education system is the structure of all the institutions and opportunities for obtaining education within a country. But the educational system of a country is based on a global educational structure. So for example, if I do start a school tomorrow, it is important that I have a primary, a K-12, and higher education system, right? And this is just generally accepted as the model of education. This does not necessarily mean it's right or wrong, it just means it's more conventional. Okay, now there's two ways to actually shift the educational system. There's the top down and the bottom up, right? The top down is anything that can happen from a governmental level or from a political or a policy or a communal level. So basically it's anything that an organization or a legal body or a country chooses to enforce. That'll be considered a reform, right? And a best way to have a reform is to actually collapse the power structures. So for example, in AI, South Korea has introduced this AI education policy where a lot of their curriculum is being built around AI. And Singapore's AI for Everyone program, they do teacher training and skill development for AI for teachers across the country. This is actually something that's common across many countries where there is reform that's being created to introduce AI into the education, right? The other way this can happen is actually through ideas, like I just gave the example of apple picking, but it's a revolution, which basically means that an idea gains enough momentum that it creates and pushes change from the bottom up to the top level, which means that it creates structures as the idea gains more momentum. So you can see these in like challenger universities, where universities are adopting AI or adopting technology. You can see these in MOOCs or online courses, and you can also see these in alternative schools. Like Green School, School of Humanity, that uses AI, for example. But again, the thing about revolutions and about reform is that it's not always necessary that the idea is a good idea. It just means that the idea has momentum. So there's problems with the revolution, which is you might have a lot of people who agree on something, but that might not necessarily be based on fact, right? On the other side, you might also have really powerful top-down structures that have a lot of power, but do not have enough ability to get feedback from the bottom up. So most structures are often very reinforcing, but it really depends on the structure, right? So structures that are resilient are usually structures that are open to feedback from the bottom up, where they can use that to build reform. And there is a proper feedback loop and the communication channels are open. Right, so this might be an easier way to understand that. There's top down, which is reform, and bottom up, that's the revolution. And top down is basically these global standards of education. So for example, this is anything that's conventional. So it might be 4-year university, it might be a 2-year master's program, it might be 12 years of schooling, 13 in some countries. But the benefits of reform or top-down enforcement of policy is that oftentimes you have experts who are involved in the decision-making process, right? And you also have people who have the greater ability and scope to see the whole or bigger picture. So for example, if there's a global educational standard, they're able to compare what's working in one country versus another country, or one state versus another state, or one city versus another city. So they have the ability to see the way that the network is connected with each other and what's working in one place versus what's not working in another. So the transfer of ideas can actually be a lot more efficient if the top-down structure is efficient and functional. The other way that the education system can be changed is also through the revolution, which is going to look a little bit more like this. It's more complicated, it's more intricate, you have more sharing of information, it's a lot more collaborative. For example, we might sit down in this chat and we might discuss apple picking is a horrible idea, this is not what you must teach in schools. But it's really important that you teach skills for AI, right? So the bottom-up process is a lot more collaborative. It's also a lot more adaptable to the local standards. So for example, if you have a school in a city with a desert, it might be better for you to teach how to navigate that landscape as opposed to having a more generalized teaching about climate, right? So there's a lot more adaptation that can happen from the bottom up, which is also where the feedback comes from, right? So I know there was a lot of information, but let's just quickly go into AI and technology in the education system, right? So how does AI affect the institution of education, right? So we're at a very uncharted, unprecedented time in human history, right? So over time, this is how much progress we were making, and all of a sudden, there's just so much progress that we don't really know how to adapt to this as quickly, because it's exponential, right? So we are basically this little human being right here trying to figure out what happens next. How do you adapt the education system to it? Well, the education system is already very rigid and is not very open to changes quickly. So we're trying to make the most of the time that we're in with the resources that we currently have, which is not an easy thing at all. So currently, these are the 5 main ways that AI is being used in global education. These are 5 basic high-level areas. So it's basically vision, voice, natural language, algorithms, and hardware. So vision is basically where, for example, you have your phone, when you open it, it can scan your face. So vision is basically when the AI can look at someone's expressions and can gauge whether someone is aware of what is being taught or not. So you can use technology and AI and software to figure out, is the student really understanding what is being taught or what is not? Voice is basically so the same way where you have like text to speech, or you have speech to text, for example, voice is basically having a voice-enabled classroom where speech can be converted to text quickly. Natural language, I think this is a big issue with AI because the way people speak and the way people communicate and write is often very different across different people, across places. However, there is a lot of progress in natural language with AI as well. Algorithms is basically recommendation systems. It's notifications that can send a notification to an app which says, hey, now's the time for you to come to class. This is the time for you to do homework. You might get emails and recommendations and notifications based on the algorithms. Hardware is basically what are the capacities that we have in terms of the hardware. So this can be in terms of classes, in terms of technology, in terms of like projectors. What do we need for schools? What do we need for education that is actually tangible and physical? Right? So I just want to talk a little bit about structural divides and connect that with the AI, right? So when we spoke about structures, I think it's also really important to touch upon how AI might have really significant structural divides across the world. While some countries are more technologically enabled, there's plenty of countries that are not. And the more that we create success metrics that are associated with the integration of AI, the more we're likely to leave certain countries and certain groups of people behind. Right? So I just want to talk very briefly about the AI divide. I know this is a lot of information, so please feel free to stop me at any point if you want to like slow down or ask questions. But the AI divide is basically in 4 levels. where we go from no access to AI to complete understanding of AI. So no access to AI is basically the digital divide. So you and I might have a phone and a computer, while someone else in a rural area might just not have a phone or not have access to technology at all. So not just does this it just not just does it like reduce their competitiveness, but they're just not able to even catch up. The second level is access to AI but no understanding. So educational institutions might have access to AI, might have access to computers, but they do not have the skills to use them. This might be because they're not trained effectively. It might be because they don't have enough digital literacy skills, but they're just not able to use the technology that they have effectively, right? And these barriers grow over time as well, where the people who are left behind are oftentimes left behind because of how exponential the growth is. The third level of the AI divide is access to AI, but it's not efficient use of AI. So you have institutions that have access to AI, they have the training, but they might have resistance to new technology. They might also have poor strategy. There might be nobody in charge of their AI strategy. There might be nobody in charge of telling them how to use AI in classrooms, but also poor integration into systems that they currently have. So there's just a divide between the access and the integration. And the fourth one is complete access to AI and understanding of AI. So this means that there's no digital divide at all, and there's ethical and efficient use of AI at all levels. So this is just a quick image of what I just spoke about, just because it's easier to understand. Basically, the gap in the first level is that there's no awareness. In the second level, there's no competency. In the third level, there isn't enough knowledge. And in the fourth level, there's not enough integration, right? So I just want to bring up a few statistics from COVID, because all of a sudden the use of technology skyrocketed during COVID, just to point to this digital divide and this technological divide and this AI divide that we're having, which is lack of internet access, lack of devices, and structural divides increase. So one of the statistics is that half of the world's population, as of 2021, just did not have access to any internet at all, right? So if you're going to move towards an AI revolution, then we need to take into account all of the people we're leaving behind. The second one is also lack of devices. In the US alone, families earning less than $25,000, 1/3 of them just do not have a computer. And also just structural divides increase because the poorest countries do not have the ability to support learners. So what can we do? This is going to be very brief, right? So we're going to go back to this idea of structures and ideas from the start, where we define an intervention or an idea, and then we test it out, right? And this can be any small interventions on a small level. It doesn't necessarily need to be structural, right? So this can be anything like replacing exams with assignments, or allowing AI while doing exams, or allowing it more in the classrooms. But there are certain things to keep in mind about how do we decide if they're effective. The first thing you need to do is measure the impact. But to measure the impact, first you need to identify the intervention, right? And then you have to identify the starting point. And then you can maybe choose to have an RCT, where you have a control group and you have another group, and then you can test the progress of one group against another over a specific period of time, right? Then you need to identify the metrics and identify which metrics are we measuring over this period of time. And then we have to monitor and constantly iterate, right? And these are what I think are the most relevant skills in the age of AI, which is discernment and bias recognition. Any AI that we use are biased based on the people who are coding in that AI. So that's something important to recognize. The second thing is emotional intelligence. While AI can give you information, it cannot really replace emotional intelligence. It's really important to test, monitor, and evaluate. Are the interventions we're doing really helpful? Are they effective? These are important for us to test. The fourth skill that you really need is how do you interact with AI. It's not important for us to learn information anymore, but it's really important for us to learn how to get that information. And two more skills that are really important is training and development. When something moves and changes really quickly, we need to train people really quickly, right? And we also need critical thinking and creativity, because I don't think creativity can be replaced by machine. That's pretty much it.